How is it that the one who works faithfully for 37 years in one job gets laid off just before he can take advantage of his full retirement package? What explanation can you offer the person who just finished building his family home only to have a tornado take it away a month later? How is it that the one who gave so much of herself to others dies in a tragic car accident at a young age, but the one who lives to fulfill her own pleasures makes it to 94 without repentance? What do you say to the person who got a good raise last year, but he actually has less income to spend now due to inflation? Why is it that the one with little resources cannot fight City Hall on a misdemeanor, but another can walk away without penalty, having been proven guilty of a felony? Why is it that in the same town, the farmer is praying for rain, and the vacationer is praying for sunshine? And when the rain comes, one praises God for answered prayer, and the other one is certain that God never heard him. These kinds of questions are very 21st century. And yet at the core, they're as old as the earth. I can't say if people are asking such things with more frequency now, or if they've been asking that at the same rate for millennia. But if you've never pondered such questions, perhaps you are blissfully unaware of the disconnect between what should be and what ends up happening. Honestly, that's very naive. Pretending that things all add up when they don't is ignoring reality. On the other hand, if you've constantly pondered such questions, perhaps you are way too focused on the dark things of this earth. You need a new focus. Obsessing over the inability to make sense of everything will lead to despair. God wants neither one for us. And given the fact that such wondering is nothing new, a couple of years ago, Pew Research asked for answers to a question of why things don't work as we expect them to. In your own words, they asked, why do you think terrible things happen to people through no apparent fault of their own? 8% said it had to do with the presence of evil or sin in the world. That's a pretty good answer. But we cannot always pinpoint the specific evil or sin that brought the consequences we witness. About the same amount blamed the system or other people. That's a very 21st century America kind of answer. And yet the largest percentage basically viewed the incongruities of our earthly experience through this lens. Life happens. It does. What unsettles us is that we have a core sense that things should work out a certain way, and when they do not, we wonder why. Fortunately, God has given us one Old Testament book that does a very deep dive into this puzzle, the book of Ecclesiastes. It deals head-on with the meaning and purpose of life, and yet it is a book that has no easy answers. In fact, it leaves most of the questions that have been asked for generations largely unanswered. Welcome to our study of Ecclesiastes. Many famous passages and proverbial one-liners come from its pages, including a top hit folk song in the 1960s. Since this particular book is such a puzzle, we need to keep certain things in mind before we try to swim in the deep waters that make up the 12 chapters. The first thing is this: the genre of writing. Wisdom literature is a kind of writing that deals with how to live well. Those who want to maintain harmonious relationships with friends, family, and God, who wish to avoid foolish mistakes in everyday life. And yet this genre of writing takes on different forms. In the poetic form, there's repetition, where one description is set next to another. The pattern offers either more color to the original statement, or the second statement stands in contrast to the first, like the book of Proverbs. So Ecclesiastes is similar, since it contains short, single-line statements that are descriptive, yet not always clear on application. In addition, the book itself says that it is proverbial. And yet, in another way, it's similar to Job, since it contains the thoughts and statements of the people involved. In Job, there were dialogues between the various individuals, including God. While in Ecclesiastes, it's more of a series of monologues, of self-reflection. The writer makes an observation or asks a question and then offers some response. Yet it's also unique from other Old Testament wisdom literature since it has phrases or words that are not found in other Old Testament books. And yet what makes Ecclesiastes stand out is that the situations described and the questions raised are so familiar that they cut across time and continents. In fact, on a gut level, as you read through it, you will probably feel more familiar with that book than you do most other books of the Bible. Even if somebody has not heard a specific quote before now, once the passage is spoken, there is a natural kinship with what we hear. Because when we listen, we find ourselves agreeing. Yeah, I've considered those things. Why is life like that? Is there any meaning to be found in our experience and pursuits when what we see doesn't always add up? The quest that the author has set out on is a quest that each of us have pursued, even if it's just in our own minds. So the material that we will cover is so common to life that Ecclesiastes is a book that is timeless. One scholar suggested that it might be easier to see how this book applies to our world today than what it meant in its original context. Personally, I've had a love-hate relationship with this book, as I've been debating for literally months whether or not to tackle it with you. On the one hand, it draws me in for all the reasons I've stated so far. On the other, it's nearly impossible to find two pastors or two scholars who view the book the same way. And yet, as I was pondering if we should tackle this together, it was mentioned to me that this particular study would be an interesting contrast to our last one, where the focus was ultimately on the future and eternity. The contrast is this: the book of Ecclesiastes is squarely directed to what happens down here on earth. And that is the point we will need to keep coming back to when we study it. So in order to best understand any particular book of the Bible, it has been my practice to take the first week to provide some overview. Therefore, let me introduce some of the things that we'll be examining in the weeks ahead. The authorship of Ecclesiastes traditionally has been accepted as Solomon. But the author's name does not appear anywhere in the book, as it does in so many other Old Testament prophets or New Testament authors. At the same time, there are internal reference points that become evidence for identifying the author. So let's begin with Ecclesiastes 1:1. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. The book begins from a third-person perspective, where the narrator introduces the words of the teacher or preacher, which will then begin in verse 2. This is not a proper name, but a title. And either one is a good English equivalent of the Hebrew word that is used, Kohelet. In the centuries leading up to Christ's birth, the Hebrew rabbis translated their scrolls into Greek. And that Greek version became the standard version for many people who were outside of Judea and didn't speak Hebrew the same way they used to. It's from that Greek translation of the same word, Kohelet, that our book title gives us the title of this book, Ecclesiastes. Now, the term Kohelet is a word to describe one who calls an assembly for the purpose of giving instruction. His role is to impart wisdom to the people through teaching what he came to understand. Now, teaching typically appeals to the mind, and its main purpose is to impart information, whereas preaching typically appeals to the will, and its main purpose is to promote action. So our reference to teacher or preacher, depending on your translation, makes sense, as the author is serving in both these roles, to have us use our minds and to be moved to do something. But the teacher identifies himself by a few other markers in the first couple of chapters as well. We saw two in verse 1, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And within the first couple of chapters, we find even more. King over Israel in Jerusalem, one wiser than anyone who ruled over Jerusalem before him. A builder of great projects, buildings, vineyards, gardens, parks, and reservoirs are all specifically mentioned. One who possessed numerous slaves, sheep, cattle, and flocks, and one who owned great wealth and a harem. These descriptions have led believers to accept Solomon as the author of the book. He is the only one that fits all of those descriptions, and he is the one who is most recognized as the author of many proverbs. Beyond the author, the next few contextual questions would include when and to whom this was written. Well, Solomon ruled for 40 years, so the timetable would be somewhere during his reign, and his audience would naturally be his subjects, the citizens of Israel. Now, as we look back on Jewish history, it is natural and correct to picture the time of Solomon as the high point in Israel's monarchy. It really was. He was the richest and wisest man to ever rule the nation. His natural boundaries or national boundaries and the trade agreements he had with all the other groups around him were as widespread as they ever would be under Israel. Plus, during his rule, there were no wars with surrounding nations, and his reputation of fame was widespread. But if you know anything about him, he had a few flaws and quite a few women. First King tells us that the spouses and girlfriends were all from all over the Middle East, and their religious influence brought great trouble to Solomon and his family. And then for generations after him, the nation suffered terribly by allowing so much idolatry to come into the land. Beyond that, the king divided his nation into different districts for collecting taxes. And those districts did not really recognize the historical boundaries of the 12 tribes that God had set in place. So you could be from the tribe of Benjamin, but since your land was in another district, your taxes may be higher than the other Benjaminites. That inconsistency bred resentment. It turns out Solomon was more of a tax and spend kind of politician. And as soon as Solomon died, that very issue, literally a heavy tax burden, began to manifest itself in divisiveness among the nation. So the inconsistencies of life are reflected in the book that we're reading, and they would be understood by the Israelites even under Solomon's reign. Yes, life might have been pretty good with him as the king, but he was not perfect. And the issues that are recorded by the teacher would be familiar to the citizens. The people could identify with what we read in the words of the preacher. So this adds something else to know and keep in mind going forward. The author was not writing as a king. He was writing as a philosopher, not as the head of a government or even as a propagandist in his own behalf. He is a keen observer of world history, both past and current. When it comes to the larger context of the book, the most important question to examine is this one: why was it written? Fortunately, again, we are given pieces of information at the opening and the closing of the book to provide us some answer. Let's go back to the prologue. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility, everything is futile. This is his initial observation about life. Things don't always add up the way they should. And then in verse 12, the teacher opens with this statement describing the quest that he's about to set out on based on the observation he has made in verse 2. Verse 12, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to seek and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. After this introduction, the teacher walks us through his survey of life's oddities. And in that journey, we are exposed to an extensive catalog of what he discovers, such as all go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. The righteous and the wicked, the people and the animals, they all die. Death is certainly one area that grabs his attention, and we'll see that as a frequent theme. Yet another primary focal point of Solomon is the issue of work, labor, earning a living. The sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of a rich man permits him no sleep. After a hard day of physical work, it is natural to be so exhausted that you will sleep well, even if you really didn't eat that much. But the rich man who doesn't have to get up the next day, or work so hard, or worry about where the next meal comes from, cannot seem to find rest. His riches bring him worry about how to keep them or how to make more. And yet, having said that, the ability to use our skills and our strength in work is very positive. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This, too, I see, is from the hand of God. In other words, work is a God-given gift, plus it provides for our basic needs. But as the teacher later observes, the work never stops. And beyond that, the fruit of our labor is something we cannot take with us. Naked a man comes from his mother's womb, and as he comes, so he departs. He takes nothing from his labor that he can carry in his hand. These are just some of the examples of the puzzlements of life that the writer records for us in an effort to seek and explore all that man does in this world. And we will examine many more like this in the weeks ahead. Yet one of the unique features of Ecclesiastes is the form. As I mentioned at the start, it's difficult to find two scholars who see this from the same perspective. Unlike most books of the Bible, where you can outline the chapters in a reasonable fashion, trying to outline anything beyond chapter 1, verse 12 becomes quite interesting. One theologian has 4 major sections. Another has over 20. It seems there are as many possible outlines as there are people who study the book. And so while the introduction is fairly straightforward, from verse 12 on, the middle chapters are a challenge to format. I've been talking to Mark McGinnis about this, and Mark McGinnis calls it the muddled middle. And I agree. And from a preaching perspective, the unique nature of Ecclesiastes can be intimidating. That's why it took me months to decide to do it or not. And yet, as I began studying it, I came across this description that really helped me ground everything. In my estimation, this description makes the book even more approachable. The teacher moves from subject to subject and often doubles back on himself, picking up earlier themes. This fits the excruciating nature of his experience as he seeks to put the pieces of his world together, a world that has disintegrated in his hands. The journey into and through despair is anything but linear. And as is typical in such experiences, moments of great insight are often followed by lapses back into the old struggles, so that the journey is more of a spiral than a straight line. I like that word picture. Isn't our learning process about life very often 1 step forward, 2 steps back? We gain a grasp of some truth to this existence or some piece of God's word that resonates with us, and we own it with a sense of delight and accomplishment, and so we should celebrate those moments. And then some time passes, and we encounter a slightly different version of the core issue, and we're not sure how the things that we've learned now applies to this new twist. So we wrestle some more to reach another milestone of understanding. And yet in time, we will probably go through the cycle again. For the believer, the prayer is that these spirals are moving us closer to Christ's likeness and not further into the dark pit of despair. All this to say that the literary structure of Ecclesiastes does not flow easily into the kind of outline that your high school English teacher insisted you to write out for them on 1 page before you tackled your research paper. But that lack of an easy outline does seem to fit this back and forth nature of life. So maybe the muddled middle is difficult to nail down because it reflects the experience of the author over the course of time, as he is discovering and recording his insights for us to read, almost like a journal. Fortunately, again, by the end, we are given a very clear pathway to find peace in all of this. At the end, the narrator returns to offer a conclusion to everything the teacher has given us as his students. And he says, when all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is, fear God and keep his commands. The ending is concise, but the pathway to get there has led to various suggestions about Solomon's worldview. Now remember, he's the one who wrote the Song of Solomon to his wife. He's the one who wrote the book of Proverbs as he raised his children to walk in wisdom and not to be deceived by the world around them. So what about Ecclesiastes? What happened to him? Did Solomon become disillusioned with this life, try to experience everything he could and fit it into one frame? Absolute futility, says the teacher, absolute futility. Everything is futile. What does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? He goes on to say, shortly thereafter, that the sun moves about the sky day in, day out. The wind blows from every direction possible, but there's nothing new. The streams continue to flow to the coastlines, but they still don't fill up the ocean. The old die, and no one ultimately remembers them. And those who remember them now will die, and no one will really remember them either. But then in the second chapter, he goes on to say, I said to myself, go ahead, and I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. It appears that he could not find meaning in the rhythms and seasons of life, and he could not find meaning in the pleasures of life. So as a result of his apparent fruitless journey, people have seen the teacher from many contradictory viewpoints. One such conclusion is that he is a hedonist, devoted to the pursuit of pleasure. They see this and somehow they think that with all his wisdom, he just lost his faith and went headfirst into a deep dive of debauchery. Others simply decided that he's a pessimist, inclined to expect the worst possible outcome. You know, he's Winnie the Pooh's best friend, Eeyore. He can't find anything good, anything worth praising God for, any reason to keep on living. I do know this from reading through the chapters a few times now. I'm not sure that very many people have accused him of being an optimist. Another conclusion is that he is actually a fatalist, believing that events are fixed in advance so that no human beings are powerless to do anything about it. Life happens, and there's nothing you can do, so don't even try. And I would, by the way, consider a fatalist a close cousin to a pessimist. And yet one reason there are so many perspectives about Solomon's frame of mind is that any of us trying to interpret it are bringing with us our own worldview. It's impossible not to. And because of our own starting point, we end up with many interpretations of Ecclesiastes. So if you ever read any of your study notes, even you compare with your best friend two Bibles, you're going to get some different things. That's all right. Now, the hedonist is thinking, I'll take license. If Solomon tried everything, then I might as well try it as well. Maybe I'll have better success than he does. The pessimist, who finds a cloud in every silver lining, locks onto the despair and unfairness described by many passages. He ignores, though, the repeated invitations to enjoy life as God gave it. The fatalist sees Solomon as throwing up his hands, as saying it's all worthless, which he does say many times. My work, my beliefs, my relationships, my accumulated stuff, we all die and it all burns in the end. Well, we all will die, and it all will burn in the end. But none of these conclusions are sufficient to explain what we find when reading the whole of the book, not just a few verses. And for as challenging as Ecclesiastes may be, and I expect it to be, the best description of Solomon as he writes this book is that he is a realist, one who accepts and deals with things as they really are. Ecclesiastes is one of those books that forces us to wrestle with very difficult questions that are pursued relentlessly. In the process, it leads us back to the starting point of faith, but this time to know more fully. One of the other features of studying Ecclesiastes will be to examine and re-examine the vocabulary. As the spiral of coming back to earlier points continues, we will see certain words or phrases repeated. And the one we see most often is the one found in the introduction. Absolute futility, everything is futile. The Hebrew word is hevel, and it shows up almost 40 times. It is translated differently because it can have a range of similar overlapping meanings: futile, vapor, breath, lacking value. Here's some examples. All of you have seen this for yourself. Why do you keep up this hevel talk? Man is like a hevel. His days are passing shadow. They are both stupid and foolish, instructed by hevel idols made of wood. While the most familiar translation of this word might be vanity, it's not a good word for us. What that means now and what it meant several hundred years ago is not the same. Today, vanity is still empty and without value in its core, but more often when we think about it, it has to do with arrogance or self-sufficiency. That's not at all what the teacher is speaking about. So in order to have you remove vanity from your minds when you study, the meaning of hevel is clearly demonstrated in the context and the text itself. Here's an example. Absolute futility, everything is futile. What does a man gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? You see, this has to do with purpose. What makes sense? And a corollary to this term, which the preacher also gives us, is a word picture that has been captured by authors, playwrights, philosophers, and songwriters ever since: chasing after the wind. So while the word that repeats so often can mean without meaning or vanity, Ecclesiastes does not use it that way. It's not about being without meaning, even though the NIV uses that word, and I like the NIV. It's about the fact that what we observe in life so many times does not fit together neatly. The inconsistencies that we see and experience on a core level cannot be grasped. They are an enigma, a mystery, to us at least, not to God. Dr. Warren Wiersbe, one of my favorite guys to go to for one-liners, says that one of his seminary professors described this same word by another helpful image: whatever's left over after you break a soap bubble. Vapor, senseless, absurd, futile, enigma. Therefore, as we go through Ecclesiastes together, I expect to use a combination of these terms, since our English Bibles do as well. Another repeated term is the one that describes the context in which Solomon makes his observations and tries to find purpose and value under the sun. The preacher was writing about life experience down here on earth. Now, some Bible students have taken this to mean anything on earth without God in the mix, but I don't think it's that restricted. Because as I mentioned at the start, the observations and experiences of the teacher are those that are all common to us, those of us without faith and those of us with faith. It is this earthbound emphasis that stands behind the phrase "under the sun." Let's look at it from this angle. While the teacher mentions death many times, he is not dealing with what takes place after this life, not in any detail. And that makes sense if you put yourself in the sandals of an Old Testament believer during his reign. The Old Testament believer had very little insight into anything beyond this earth. Think for a moment of some of the things that we learned in our previous study about heaven and eternity. We have exponentially more information about what awaits us than anybody did in the Old Testament. And those images and descriptions of eternity that we have now were only revealed after the death and resurrection of Christ. So the Old Testament believer did look ahead to the place of death, to Sheol. And he believed that God would honor those who honored him, and he would punish the unrighteous, as each of those type of people made it to the other side. But very few details were available for Solomon or anyone else to lock their thoughts onto the images that we've been given. So under the sun is a shorthand for the restricted sphere of activities that the teacher was privileged to observe. To be under the sun is to be identified to what is universally true for all humanity, believer and non-believer alike, throughout all time since the fall of mankind. The teacher tells his readers how to live in a world as it really is instead of living in a world of false hope. So let's try to answer that very important question. Why was it written? You know, the ancient myths and holy writings that are made up paint pretty pictures so that none of the heroes of those particular religious systems look bad. And yet the presence of this one book in our 66 books of the Bible is evidence that God wanted us to have it. And that believers need not and should not deny the reality of life as it really is under the sun. It can be harsh, unjust, distressing, and full of sorrow. And it can be beautiful, satisfying, enjoyable, and full of purpose. The teacher says there is tragedy and there is something good. When times are good, be happy, he says. But when times are bad, consider this: God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. Given these two ends of our earthly existence, readers have looked to the statements of the teacher and claimed that he contradicts himself. So many times he says, it's all vapor. It doesn't appear to have any meaning that can be discerned. And then he goes on to say, enjoy life and food and friendship and the accomplishment of your work. Well, which one is it? Both and. And I'm not convinced that he's contradicting himself at all. I believe he's identifying contradictions that he's observed in the world around them, uncovered them, and recorded them for us. Koheleth was neither a relativist nor a skeptic. He was an orthodox realist and godly sage. He did not dismiss life as inconsequential or even counter-rational, but instead he called his readers to use the very pains and pleasures of life as generators of dependence. In other words, to fear the supreme creator, whose judgments are unsearchable and whose ways are inscrutable. So, as we come to soak and bathe in the 12 chapters that we're going to tackle, we will see that one other popular view of Ecclesiastes is not quite on target either. There is an idea that what we read describes the life of the poor soul without God. But does it? Believers have never had to wrestle with any of the issues raised in the book. Believers always have a life that makes sense and brings joy and never allows us to worry about our work or our relationships or our legacy. I don't think so. Let me add one more puzzle to this existence. People actually do enjoy this life without God. Many of us did before we came to know Christ. So Ecclesiastes is not a book written to describe a life without God. In fact, the Lord is mentioned 41 times, and the fact that we will answer to him is mentioned several times as well. So it's not that we're unable to find some fulfillment, joy, or even purpose and meaning in our work or in our discoveries on this planet. It is that all such satisfaction or suffering on this earth is temporary. And that's where our relationship with God comes in. The contentment or joy that we get to experience from time to time does not last. It is fleeting. It's a vapor chasing after the wind. And without God, those sufferings or joys or accomplishments have no lasting value. The teacher intended to demonstrate empirically to people the insecurity of all human effort to provide any real meaning, value, or significance to their lives under the sun, and to drive them to trust in God alone. Solomon was no pessimist, cynic, or skeptic, as some critics have claimed. He was a believer who sought to destroy people's confidence in their own efforts, their own abilities, their own righteousness, and to direct them to faith in God as the only possible basis for meaning, value, and significance. Ecclesiastes is a nuanced book, and that's why it's going to be a challenge for us to get through it, but I'm kind of excited and kind of scared too. So as we begin this first week of studying this book together, let me offer you this challenge. The preacher invites us to engage in his journey and struggle with him in his pursuit of clarity. As he moves from observing life as it really is, he wonders how things are what they are. He questions the value of work and relationships, pleasure, food, and everything else under the sun. And he comes to a basic yet critical conclusion to everything. So the invitation basically is, let's get dirty in the mud with him. Let's not be afraid to witness the mess and admit that we don't have all the answers, even when we know Jesus Christ personally and we know where we're headed. And when we wish we had more to offer by way of some explanation when an individual is asking, let us be content with the preacher's summary. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. To get to this conclusion and to own it, we must struggle along with the teacher to live between the two ends of our existence. On the one hand, the vapor and absurdity of it all, and on the other, to enjoy what God gave you. Dr. Warren Wiersbe has created Bible studies for most books of the Bible, if not all of them, and he has called his study of Ecclesiastes, Be Satisfied. I think that's a pretty good title. It does not deliver the gospel message. Ecclesiastes is a much more basic book. It calls the reader to look to God when we have no answers for life. It doesn't draw us to look to eternity. That's a New Testament concept more solidly. But it does require us to look beyond the puzzle of this existence. And it asks us to trust the one who is sovereign over that puzzle. That was the challenge for the original listeners some 3,000 years ago. And for us to appreciate what we read, we need to see the world from their vantage point when we read through it. When we see the same discrepancies that the teacher notes and writes down, the same wickedness, the same disconnect between what should be and what ends up being, keep this in mind. The followers of Christ have a tremendous advantage compared to the original audience. Since the resurrection, we have clear descriptions, detailed promises, and greater insight into what awaits us in the life after. And because of that, we know that all that we do on earth can have value and meaning, even when those blessings or sufferings are temporary. The truth is, even our failures have value as they mold us to be more like Christ's Son. And when we encounter the futility of things, we have the promises of God to hold on to and the glory of Christ's presence awaiting us when we arrive. So I suppose one of the challenges that we're going to face is to keep reminding ourselves that when we read through Ecclesiastes, the eternal picture is not the focus. So don't look for it. The focus is much more earthy, literally. Solomon went on a quest, observed and learned everything he could, and then he wrote down the book to teach the people of Israel to trust God, even though their future was only a shadow of understanding compared to our own. What he sees and discovers and undergoes are all on this side of the grave, everything that's common to human experience, no matter where you live, no matter what period of history you're in, no matter what cultural or social differences there may be between you and somebody else. And the teacher uses this phrase to instruct us with that focus, under the sun. Let's pray. Father, thank you for giving us a snapshot of some of the wrestling that we're going to do in the days ahead. And Father, I pray as we go through this Old Testament mine with all the gems that we'll be able to locate, that you'd give us clarity, humility, patience, the ability to discern what's most critical and what's not. Father, help us to grasp the word pictures that your author has put together and allow us to come out on the other end with greater clarity, but if not, greater trust in the cloudiness. Help us, Father, to be able to see you in spite of what's going on, to hold on to eternal values when the pleasures of the world are temporary, to be able to enjoy what we have been given by you, recognizing that it's only a foretaste of what will be permanent. Father, give us a perspective from this earth in light of heaven, with the wisdom to be able to be a good testimony for the people who are asking the same questions we are. Amen.